My name is Joe Aiello. I am the National Field Coordinator for the Rail Passers Association. Welcome to another one of our monthly webinar series. This month, we are bringing you the impact of positive onboard experience. We're going to start off with my introduction. I'm going to kick it off to Jeans-Gail, our Vice President of Government Affairs and Policy. He's going to give legislative updates. We will then bring up Madison Butler, our Communications Manager, and they will be giving the main presentation. We will then be joined by President and CEO Jim Matthews for the question and answer session, and then I will come back at the end and thank you all for coming. So without further ado, I welcome Jeans-Gail.
Thank you, Joe. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to give a quick federal brief today, and I will try to keep it brief. I think we have a very solid program here that's going to be a little bit more entertaining than the ins and outs of surface transportation reauthorization, but it is important, and you can't have dining service and onboard amenities unless you have a functioning rail network. So I'll begin with the bipartisan negotiations taking place between the White House and Senate Republicans over the infrastructure proposal, broadly defined. I think there is even a gap between what is meant by that. Certainly the White House and President Biden have made clear that they think the American Jobs Act is above and beyond what is happening in the surface transportation reauthorization. However, the Senate Republicans do seem to be talking about what they want in a surface transportation authorization. We have closed the deficit, and that is good news. It went from 2.3 trillion top line to 1.7 trillion for the White House's proposal. And it calls for, it retains calls for significant new investments in transit, rail, and electric vehicles. I haven't seen specifics on what the new passenger rail top line is, but I would think it would be within the ballpark of that 80 billion, if not exactly that 80 billion, because a lot of that reduction in spending was because they transferred funding from the Infrastructure American Jobs Act kind of proposal to another bill Senate is currently working on, and it's the non-traditional infrastructure. So it's unclear what kind of chip that will be, what kind of value that chip will have in negotiations with senators on the Republican side of the aisle, as they will, of course, notice that. There's a little bit of division in the Republican caucus in the Senate about how far they want to go in meeting the White House and President Biden. Senator Capito just said that they seem, for even after closing a little bit of the delta there, they seem further apart. However, Senator Wicker remains optimistic. He is a leading voice in infrastructure and good centrist bipartisan voice that is well respected on both sides of the aisle and in our group certainly. And he is going to lead a $1 trillion counteroffer, which will be released tomorrow morning. It's expected to be paid for by repurposed COVID money, which is going to be a red flag for a number of people in the Democratic caucus. And I think it would be a lot of, we would be against, as a organization, any attempt to take emergency funding already in the hands of transit agencies and Amtrak and call that new funding. There will be few. He also indicated there will be few increases in user fees and no tax increases. So this would be likely deficit funded and or through general tax fund transfers. As Bob Williams said, I'm getting an echo, so I don't know if anyone else is unmuted, but hopefully that clears up. Okay, so can I get the next slide, Joe? So a few outstanding questions, again, just specific to kind of these bipartisan infrastructure negotiations between the White House and Senate Republicans. The Office of Management and Budget is going to release the White House budget proposal on May 28th. And the question is, how does that fit into these negotiations? The White House spokesperson says, the American Jobs Act is part of that. So that could very much affect what kind of funding levels we see, not only for FY22, which is the coming year, but also through the reauthorization or not. And then the second question is, how serious are the kind of 10-ish or so Republicans on the Senate side in their negotiations with the White House? Are they rerun? I've heard some corners of the of Capitol Hill wondering if this is not a rerunning of their successful strategy with the American Care Act, where they, through negotiations, they fundamentally altered the infrastructure of the ACA, kind of brought the Democrats to a less ambitious proposal, but ultimately not a single senator on the Republican side voted for it. I'm not going to get into a healthcare debate here, but we would obviously be very wary and actively work against any attempt to kind of reduce the ambition of a passenger rail and transit program as a way to secure bipartisan approval, only to get 0 votes. Now, the Democrats had a much bigger margin in the Senate during that, so there's not completely analogous. However, I do think that given some of the difference between reauthorization and reconciliation, it's something to keep our eye on, and I'll get into that a little bit later. Joe, can I get the next slide? So this graphic arrived in my inbox this morning, and I thought it was helpful, not only because it shows you how many different pieces, it's from Bloomberg Government, how many different pieces there are in the Surface Transportation Bill. You got highways, which goes through Environment and Public Works Committee. Public transportation goes through Banking and Housing Committee. Our area of expertise, area of focus, passenger rail, intercity rail, Amtrak, high-speed rail, that goes through Commerce, Science, and Transportation. And then you have the financing piece, which goes through the Finance Committee. That's all on the Senate side. The other piece is the House side, which is much more streamlined. So you have everything goes through highways, transit, rail, ports, et cetera. It goes through T&I Committee, and then financing goes through Ways and Means. So a lot of moving pieces, but I also wanted to just show you that the Surface Transportation Bill, even in this graphic representation, when they show all the different pieces, they just present it as a highway bill. And that's kind of the mentality, too much, in my opinion. Joe, can we get the next slide? But you can kind of see this in the first bill out of the gates. The Senate EPW today advanced a bill by a 20-0 vote, so unanimous, very bipartisan. That's going to provide $304 billion in funding for highways over 5 years. FHWA specifically, there's some, I think, bike pedestrian infrastructure that will be involved in it, but the vast majority is going to highways and highway expansion specifically. That's a 34% funding boost over FAST Act levels. It's 22% above the CBO inflation adjusted baseline. There are tiny little pieces that go to multimodal projects. Rail highway grade crossings got a slight increase to $245 million. The federal share was increased to 100%. That's good. And incentives to close a grade crossing increased from 7,500 to 100,000. So the thing is, the Highway Trust Fund and the Mass Transit accounts are on a deadline, September 30th, 2021. They are not eligible for reconciliation. So it does make sense that they prioritize this. I just also think it's worth pointing out that, what we're seeing is bipartisan excitement in the Senate to pass a massive expansion of highway funding, paired with an inability to move forward on the American Jobs Plan, which prioritizes fix it first and no highway expansion. This is all going to be subsidized by debt and income tax revenues, which are the exact arguments we see against expanding and improving passenger rail service. But it could be applied to highways, but it just doesn't seem to gain purchase. So that's kind of our job, is to remind people this is all deficit funding. Highways don't make money. Passenger trains, meaningful passenger train service with quality service, quality onboard service. That's just part of a healthy transportation system. Next slide, Joe. We were hoping to see the House T&I markup today. It was delayed because they wanted to do due diligence on earmarks. So House members requested almost 2,400 projects in total, equivalent of $14.9 billion in funding. There were about 50 rail projects where we're still trying to comb through. It's obviously a big database. They include Long Bridge between DC and Virginia, zero emission locomotives, pilot for Metro in Chicago, and an expansion of the implementation blueprint for Valley Link in California. So I think it's a good selection of projects. We would like to see more rail, and hopefully in future iterations of this bill, we will see more rail. House Republicans, they went even further than Senate Republicans. They put forward a $400 billion plan for infrastructure over 5 years, highways and mass transit only, no Amtrak, no passenger rail title. And so that's kind of, again, where their caucus is at. They don't have the leverage that the Senate does. So we will see the details shortly. I expect to see the new markup sometime mid-June, late June. Next slide, Joe. So, with these delays, with how much there is to do, time is running short. House vote again June 14th. Means you got to get the markup through committee, through the House floor. The Senate's got to come out with their version through Senate Commerce, and then reconcile the two. You're going to have a July 4th recess. House schedule is going to be remotely for committee work in July. In-person votes really kind of starting in July 20th for the House. And then you have debt limit expansion, you have August recess. The FAST Act extension expires at the end of September, which is right, our meeting in DC will be right before that. So we will be somewhat fairly well positioned, I think, to really have a say in that process and kind of push it over the line. Obviously, we'll be working over the summer as well. The current budget resolution expires September 30th as well. That's important because, if you want to use reconciliation, you got to use it within a certain budget resolution window. And given how much there's to do, we might be looking at missing that window this year and pushing, again, some sort of big infrastructure bill into the fall. So it's going to be a lot of hurry up and wait. It's going to be a lot of work. We appreciate you, all your attention and working with us. We have an open action alert right now to let you contact your senators and representatives. Joe, next slide. We've also launched our mayor's campaign for the summer. We sent out messages to 500 plus Amtrak mayors and town managers, asking them for the inclusion of strong passenger rail title and the creation of new federal programs to fund additional frequencies, establish new passenger rail corridors, restore service. This is, again, all important things. We don't want there just to be a bill that, buys a few new train sets and, addresses the state of good repair on the Northeast Corridor. Those are important things. We do need to do those. That cannot be the only thing we do in this bill. So, again, we'll contact you as this process develops with opportunities to get involved. And we thank you for your attention. Next slide, Joe. Thank you. Any questions? You can reach me at Jeans-Gail@narprail.org. I don't want to go too long because I know we have a very interesting program that Maddie has put together. So I will close with that. And again, any questions, just reach out to me after. Thank you.
So I'm I have the pleasure of introducing our presenter. Most of you, I hope, know Maddie. Um, the slide only captures a tiny fraction of the expertise Maddie brings to this topic. Maddie was our Summer by Rail intern a couple years ago, and the trip that year was all about food. It was about the onboard food experience as well as food destinations around the United States. Maddie is an Escoffier graduate. She did project management, and Maddie was also instrumental in launching some restaurants before coming to the association. So whether we're looking at the onboard experience, the food and beverage issues, from a professional standpoint and from the standpoint of a traveler, I think Maddie is especially well qualified to present on this topic. And without further ado, I want to introduce you to Madison Butler, our communications director, but also so much more.
Thank you, Jim. So let's dive into it. Let's talk about reestablishing service post-COVID. I know a lot of you have questions about the dining car, onboard services, and sort of the trajectory of how these things are going to go. So I want to just answer all the questions that I've received, and we're going to do that over the next couple slides. So we have congressional support, hardworking teams at Amtrak, and robust passenger support to diversify how food service is provided on board. So what have been the biggest hangups in getting our services back on track? Primarily the repeal of the MICA amendment. This is sort of a misguided piece of legislature that was actually more detrimental than helpful in regards to how Amtrak food and beverage works. And we've had a lot of members work on advocating for the repeal of that amendment. Transparent channels of communication to Congress and working groups by Amtrak. We have a number of elected officials who are very passionate, and we have a number of groups within the association, within workers at Amtrak, who all want to work together to change this. So we want to make sure that we're highlighting those things, in our push to reestablish service. Quality control. And this has been an issue that has plagued flexible dining and the inconsistencies between routes. And granted, during COVID, a lot of that is due to regional protocol, to the confusion of the ongoing pandemic. And lastly, connectivity. And this is more of a universal term that I'm using here. I mean connectivity in the sense of bringing Wi-Fi on board, of having clear channels of communication with the public, and working with social media to use it as a tool to connect and not just inform. Can the next slide? So let's start with the facts. What we know is daily service, the rollout for restoration of those trains that were previously daily before COVID has begun this week, and we'll continue to see that service model develop. In regards to the limited services that we're already running 3 times weekly, we are going to keep pushing as an association to get those on track to become daily services. And I think as we see the restoration process build, we can be able to keep developing our platforms there. Restoration of dining car services. I know this is a big one for everybody joining us at home. Amtrak is aiming for the end of June with a staggered return of non-disposable place settings to follow. We've seen all this chatter online about, well, what's coming back when? How are we going to know? Keep an eye on Amtrak's social media over the next month. We've been really leaning on them to just, put out what's happening and when it's happening. So you'll be able to keep a close eye on that and follow along with that restoration protocol. The process will be different for the Eastern and Western long distance routes. We're still working on getting more information about that. I will share it with you as soon as I do get that information. But these are different patterns of service, different amounts of lengths that the average passenger is staying overnight or consuming additional meals on board. So we're going to keep a close eye on that trajectory. Of course, this timeline is dependent on the return, hiring, and training of everybody who works within OBS, as well as the logistics and the commissary teams as well. So, as they're doing things like getting ServSafe certified, finishing with the onboard services overhaul that we're seeing post-COVID as highlighted in their employee handbook, we're keeping a close eye on this timeline, but all signs point to it being a much more positive summer than this time last year. And some routes are beta testing, placing the food order when you purchase your ticket. So what this does is relieve a lot of the guessing game for both the logistics teams, the commissary teams, and well, the onboard teams as well, in that they'll know what they're stocking ahead of time. This can help reduce food waste, and it can help the customer anticipate what their experience is going to be like. Can I have the next slide? So we had the facts. Let's talk about what's possible and what's really unlikely. And I think this will help to level set the expectation of our advocates and our members, as well as, you know, taxpayers and riders and the general public. So it is possible is the development of a congressional working group to provide clear metrics expected by the taxpayers. This is an initiative that I am spearheading alongside the members of our policy team to develop. But we want to give a clear channel between the association and our elected officials on what the metrics we want as consumers, as taxpayers, as members of the community. A menu overhaul, including items most requested by association members, is possible. I know a number of you participated in Jane Arneson's signature campaign. We had over 150,000 people sign the campaign that we delivered to Cohen's office. And when Representative Cohen gave his testimony regarding that matter, you know, he recounted his memories of the experiences that he had had on board that were really delightful. And so we have been continuously pushing for that overhaul. Brokering further discussions with Amtrak for transparency in food and beverage allocation, spending, and the critical path for that team. I think this is something that is possible with better conversations and more intentional dialogues. But I personally would love to hear more about how they allocate funding for food and beverage and what the spending, what the food waste, the waste for, you know, plastics and single serving non-reusable materials is like. So also we want to provide Amtrak with onboard food preparation methods that are not a microwave. There are so many different techniques that can be utilized, like sous vide, convection oven, air frying, ways that we can upgrade that perception of value. So let's get into what's unlikely. Historical dining trends, you know, the trend-based services found on luxury cars and private passenger rail in the early 1900s, a lot of those service models and food types are fundamentally obsolete at this point. We've had Amtrak for 50 years now. And so I think it's important that we look forward into what is possible and not just, you know, demand something that doesn't actually suit the model of transportation that we're discussing. Full onboard service process overhaul before the end of 2021. I think it's unlikely. It is a really arduous task. And as you all love to say, there's so many moving parts, right? So what that process looks like, you know, we want to make sure that we're channeling transparency and we're really focused on, you know, step by step, that overhaul going into fruition. And the other thing that's unlikely, I've heard threats about this online in sort of like a vague, nebulous capacity, but people that say, well, what if McDonald's just ran food and beverage? Well, why don't we just subcontract it? The elimination of those good paying union jobs being taken over by a private entity is not going to be on the table in future conversations. Next slide. So hearing feedback, can we rely on Amtrak to provide accurate updates on how they are meeting taxpayer needs? You know, our passengers want better service. We have testified before Congress multiple times between 2019 and 21, and we've advocated for your rights as passengers and your needs as rail community members through the pandemic, through service cuts. And, you know, we already see such a great restoration trajectory. So we want to keep driving that point home. We would love to have them announce when changes go into effect in ways that make it possible for us to anticipate and be delighted by that improved experience. Amtrak media has had so many different voices over the last few years. Some of their information that they've shared has been factually incorrect, and they've had a series of advertisements that have been misleading. I've had probably 30, 40 association members send me screenshots saying, well, this is confusing, or this doesn't give me enough information, or what does this mean for my train? And so we want to make sure that those announcements, when they go into effect, are given directly to the passengers in the means that they can best interpret what that announcement says. And lastly, we want Amtrak to engage with their communities. So we have congressional support. We have a robust network of self-advocating passengers. We have the platform to create a positive trajectory for recovery. So our challenge to Amtrak is, will they rise to meet the needs of communities great and small? This is not just about connecting city center to city center. This is about everybody in between who travels as well. And those people are just as deserving of good food, good onboard experience, and a good night's rest as the people are in those city pairs on the end. Next slide. So let's talk about this survey. As some of you know, I presented the initial findings of this survey at the end of 2019, just before the pandemic hit. And I want to revisit this because a lot of this is true. And because these were survey information that was found pre-pandemic, we already saw an increase in ridership in 2019. We already saw a good trajectory in that capacity. So I think this information is still very much valid. So when we talk about the 10 passenger regions represented, people between the ages of 18 and 86 all participating in this survey, and these are Amtrak riders who are clocking, over 10,000 miles a year. 76% said that sit-down table service was the most important part of food and beverage, more so than affordable options, more so than healthy meal needs, more so than grab-and-go options. And so this is the kind of feedback that we want to continue channeling and continue modeling. Can the next slide? And these are riders who are not just retirees, they're not just vacationers, but people who use Amtrak services for a myriad of reasons. And so we want to make sure that in our advocacy that we're reflecting that desire from all different kinds of passengers. Next slide. So we want to know, how will Amtrak work to hear their most loyal customers? We've talked about, gauging process and developing clear channels of accountability. And these are just some examples of the feedback that we got through that survey form. And it's pretty much unanimous. We want dining car, we want good service, and we want coach passengers to be able to join in that as well. That is something that we are going to continue to push for through the rest of this year. And I don't have a slide for it, but we had 92% of the people surveyed said they absolutely think that coach passengers should have access to a full meal on all trains. And I feel like that's a pretty universal good, and it's pretty easy to advocate for in contrast to some of the other requests. Next slide. So unfortunately, he wasn't able to join us today, but earlier this week, I got the pleasure of speaking with Representative Colin Allred from Texas. He's been a supporter of Texas Central. He's been a supporter of Amtrak. And so, we shared the sort of broad-reaching questions that we had received from members directed to House T&I and directed to their elected officials. So I want to share that video with you all now. Joe, can you give the next slide? And let's just listen in and hear what our representative has to say here.
Hey, everybody. I want to thank the Rail Passenger Association for allowing me to take part in today's webinar on the impact of positive onboard experiences. Dallas, my home city, is much like the rest of my home state in that it's rapidly growing. And in order for us to meet the transportation needs of our booming population, we have to utilize passenger rail. As a member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, I am proud to have led the charge in Congress championing Texas Central's high-speed rail project between Dallas and Houston. I think there's much more we can do, and I really look forward to answering some of your questions. So let's get started. The first question I have here is, what service improvements are most critical, in your opinion, regarding the Amtrak recovery trajectory post-COVID? Well, first, in places like my home state in Texas, we could make common sense expansion to some of our country's biggest markets. That includes increased service to Austin and San Antonio, and then direct service to Houston. And I'll leave it to the experts to decide how often, but there's clearly demand to get people back and forth between these 4 major population centers in Texas. And I really don't think that Texas is unique, and I know there are many other regions across the country where an expansion could make sense. Second question is, what are the key ways in which Congress gauges the success of onboard services? Well, clearly ridership is one, and certainly probably number one, but I view it as creating as many convenient options as possible. That's what I'm looking for. And working together across transportation sectors is really important. That's key here in Texas. Where you have major airports, you have growing mass transit, you have hopefully the potential of high-speed rail, the Texas Central Project, and you of course have a lot of folks driving. So we need to make it as easy as possible for folks to take advantage of rail in the coming years and build out the infrastructure necessary to do that. And we've learned in Texas from our mass transit, you have to make it as easily accessible as possible. And that's something that I've been working on doing with our state and local leaders, and certainly across the country. Next question is, what would you most like to change about onboard service? Well, personally, I think traveling by train, traveling by rail is a great way to travel. But aside from improved connectivity and getting you to and from the rail station, I think improved services will really go a long way to helping create a sustainable customer base. We have some of the biggest economies in the nation here in Texas, and further connecting them through passenger rail is really only going to help create jobs and give people more options. And the onboard services and amenities should meet the needs of the traveler. Last Congress, we made great strides in the Moving America Forward Act to try and clarify the statute around providing food and beverage services, and I look forward to making similar improvements this Congress. Okay, last question is, if passed, how would the Interstate Rail Compact's Advancement Act benefit communities working to improve their passenger rail services? Well, Congress has been committed to increasing passenger rail services for decades, and I think that one of the main challenges is figuring out how to get multi-state coordination of passenger rail. And this bill by Representative Cohen could have the potential to increase and expand intercity passenger rail into regions that don't currently have rail services. And I'm really pleased that the administration has made this a priority, and I look forward to working in the committee to take a look at this bill. So thanks again for letting me participate with y'all. I look forward to working with you to improve rail services here in my home state in Texas and across the country. Thanks again.
All right, so we've heard from Representative Allred here, really good stuff. And one of the things that he and I had talked about was gauging progress and how we can gauge measurable progress, how we can create perimeters to define and look at what existing projects Amtrak has in their pipeline, what the desired outcome is, and what the key indicators of success for those projects are. So I'm going to include this slide in our follow-up materials. I'll give you all this moment to look over it. Specifically, looking for new passengers. When I say new return passengers, I mean people who take Amtrak for the first time, and then the second, and then the third, as we continue to build and develop those relationships. The key indicator of that is absolutely passenger satisfaction. And projects like coherent and controlled customer service protocol, revamping the metrics and KPIs for onboard success, and creating channels for feedback, especially after the layoffs. There were a lot of channels that had been eliminated, people that were trusted faces. And so we want to see what comes after that. I think those are the kinds of things that will guarantee new return passengers. By guaranteeing those new passengers, we're guaranteeing the dedication that we have to our national public rail infrastructure. And we'll see, more programs come alive on board and a return to the kinds of services that bring people into long distance and medium distance travel. Can I get the next slide? So finally, I want to touch on measures of accountability. And this is something I would love to hear back from our members on if you care to email me directly following the presentation. Route-specific improvements. Working groups for long distance routes comprised of workers on that train and passengers who frequent that train. By creating a clear pipeline for direct feedback and metrics from those who are actually affected and invested, Amtrak executives could make decisions with respects to the taxpayers committed to the future of this route. Secondly, eliminating confirmation bias. This plagues a lot of larger groups and larger organizations, but there's sort of a thought bubble and organizational behavior structure that surrounds executive consultation, which could be to the detriment of the passenger without the elimination of that confirmation bias. You know, we deserve consultants that come with onboard experience, not just cruise and airline experience, but from a myriad of different kinds of hospitality fronts. And I think diversifying the intake of that information can also help to eliminate that confirmation bias. And lastly, providing a transparent pipeline for feedback. With the elimination of the ACAC, passenger survey modeling, the removal of timetables from the website, and zero credible response from social media in a long-term and measurable way, how are taxpayers going to be assured that our needs are being met? And so, you know, we want to talk with our members at large and have a big conversation throughout the association on ways that we think providing that transparent pipeline for feedback to our DC office so we can then take it to Amtrak. We want to involve everybody in that conversation. So those are my thoughts today. Can I have the next slide? All of these materials are going to be available on our website. I will have a replay of this with the slides, with the video from Representative Allred, Sean's update, and the Q&A to follow, available at realpassengers.org/webinars. You can follow up on all of our previous footage there as well. So just thank you all so much for taking the time to join me today, and feel free to send any questions directly to my inbox. Joe, I'll kick it back to you.
Oh, sorry. Actually, so very quickly, Madison, thank you. Now I will kick it over both back to Madison and Jim. This will be our Q&A session. So take it away.
All right, we got Jim.
I'm here.
I'm here as well. Great. All right, so let's dig into it. Joe, can we have the first question? So Jim, I'll have you take this one first, I think. How will existing equipment be utilized to benefit the passenger, and what equipment upgrades should be prioritized?
Well, you know, that's actually kind of the multi-million-dollar question, isn't it? We have diners that were purchased a few cycles ago, and they weren't super useful in the flexible dining model. I think it's great to see that traditional dining is going to return on the Western trains, and that's a great first step. But in the meantime, we've got these viewliner diners, and they're designed to cook food. So I think that you know, that we have the infrastructure in place to continue to push for restoration of traditional dining across the system, and not just on the west. The equipment's there. I think you know, that's the kind of thing that when you do that, plus some upgrades, and you get Congress to support putting the right amount of money in place this year, as Sean was talking about earlier, so that we can get a future order in place and in the pipeline. I mean, we've got 40-year-old equipment out there. We can do some refreshes and some refurbishments, and I'm excited to see what that's going to look like here in the next few months. But over even the medium term, forget about the long term, we need Congress to really make a priority of upgrading and replacing superliner equipment and some of the older equipment that's around the system, and also the locomotives. So when we talk about priorities, it's hard to pick because there isn't a part of Amtrak that doesn't need a facelift. But certainly, I think you know, we've done a good job on the AM fleets in the Northeast, and the new Acela train sets from Alstom are coming online here very soon. So it's probably time for Congress to turn its attention to the long distance fleet, and to start to make a dent in that backlog of 35 to 40-year-old equipment that really does need to be overhauled and or replaced.
I
Joe,
apologize,
can we get the
I
next?
missed my cue. I'm supposed to be asking the questions here.
Yes, you are.
It's been a while since we've done these.
I know.
Why can't we just have the food that was served in the early 1900s? Is it just union labor costs, or are there more obstacles?
Well, I'm always going to defer to my chef on that.
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and I'm really glad that so many people asked it, honestly. And there are a couple of parts to this. Primarily, we cannot have the food that was served in the early 1900s because the way that labor worked then and the risks that people were expected to take in order to execute some of those menu items is dangerous. It's unsafe for chefs, it's unsafe for workers, and it's unsafe for passengers. There are certain things, when you start sloshing around grease or soups and you hit a bad, rough patch of track, that's a liability issue waiting to happen. And people ask too, well, union labor cost, well, maybe if we didn't have, this union or that union working on board, we wouldn't be paying for these problems. Well, that to me is, it's sort of un-American. I feel as though factoring in the cost of labor into your meals is something that's normal on all forms of transportation. You see it in the cruise industry, much to the detriment of the workers. They're often very underpaid and treated far worse than Amtrak staff is. And when we look at things like, the Pullman porters and everything that they worked for to establish safe onboard services, I think it's important to continue the trajectory of that initiative and to respect those who came before us. And as a chef, I've definitely been put in compromised positions, especially working on a food truck. And so I have a lot of empathy for the ways that we can change how production is done, but still maintain that perception of value. And I think that's what I would really like to drive home in my conversations with Amtrak is that, the aesthetics of having a nice sit-down dinner cannot be compromised. At the same time, we can do that and still be respectful to our workers.
So I want to pick up on something that you said.
Yeah,
I think, and maybe get you to expand on it a little bit.
sure.
I think there's an issue here too of sort of public tastes,
Mm,
right? I mean, in the sort of 1920s or so, I don't think anyone was worried about gluten-free. I don't think anyone was
yeah,
worried about food allergies. So I think that, you've got a group of people on the train that expect to have their allergies taken into account, their food preferences taken into account. I don't think anybody in 1929 was particularly interested in controlling their cholesterol or
right.
worried about their diabetes.
Yeah,
So poor Amtrak has got to deal with, I want my steak, I want this, I want that, but I also want gluten-free and I want, vegan and I want kosher and I think one of the cool things is this pilot about, pre-ordering your meals. And I know some people don't like that idea, but a lot of people do. And one of the cool things about that is it makes it less of a crapshoot.
yeah,
So if I know I need, enough to feed 35 vegans who are going to be on my 2-day trip, that's a good thing. That means I don't run out. That means I buy the right
yeah,
stuff. And I eliminate spoilage. So to me, that seems like a good idea.
yeah. Let's share the next question, Joe.
How is Congress working to help Amtrak meet our needs? What can we do to get our elected officials committed to funding and developing onboard services?
Sean, do you want to take that first?
Sure. So first of all, I did insert this into the chat, but quick point of clarification. We were actually able to work with the Senate offices and allies on the Hill to insert the repeal of the MICA provision, which is, the directive that requires the elimination of all, federal subsidies of onboard food and beverage service. We got rid of it in the extension of the FAST Act, which is part of the continuing resolution. It was inserted last minute. We talked about it, but again, it was part of a much larger bill. So, I understand why it kind of flew under the radar for a lot of people. That is gone. We have eliminated it. We've solved that problem. It was something we've been working on for quite a while. And I think we successfully made the case that, food and beverage and onboard amenities, they are an important marketing tool to get people on the train. It's an equity issue for people who are rural passengers who don't want to just eat garbage TV dinners for 2 days to get to, see their family or make an important trip to a, medical facility. And Congress is picking up on that. And so there was in HR2, which passed the House, but was never taken up in the Senate, a food and beverage working group that would have included state partners, Amtrak, and labor, and groups like ours. And I think actually probably the committee, we can safely say the committee was thinking about us when they drafted that provision, including passenger groups. And it directed Amtrak to work with these stakeholders to provide a plan for improving and implementing food and beverage service. Now, again, the Senate never took that up. We have a different Senate, different control of the Senate. I expect that to be I would expect that to be included in the Senate version that comes out of the Senate Commerce Committee, and that's going to give us a direct line and a mandate, particularly to influence what passengers have access to. And how food and beverages use it to market increased ridership. But I also think Amtrak probably, it's safe to say, has seen the writing on the wall. We've seen a market shift in tone. They understand where Congress is heading on this issue. And I think, I read the same kind of common boards you do. I think we probably are going to see some good things coming down the pipeline soon. While Amtrak tries to get out ahead of this. So they are not seen as just an entirely reactionary entity. So, we've secured some key wins. Not all of them have been fully implemented. We hope to get them implemented, but it's already causing a thaw, I think, at the leadership level at Amtrak. And, we thank you for your support and your advocacy on behalf of those policy provisions. Now, Jim, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I do want to add a few things there. I mean, let's be candid. When I testified before the House T&I committee, one of the big issues was the food and beverage service and the deterioration of that service. Representative Cohen was very clear in Q&A with me during the hearing about what he thought about that. And he's been a real leader on this issue in the committee really ever since. And we've been working closely with his office. And so I think, Sean makes a good point. Amtrak does not have its fingers in its ears. They have been paying attention. They do see the writing on the wall. In fact, I think I even wrote about this in our hotline last year, that there was a recognition that something needed to change with the flexible dining model. But in the middle of COVID, they weren't entirely sure what to do or how to do it. And we are seeing a commitment emerge to really try to reverse that. I think the traditional dining restoration on the Western trains, that's going to be a terrific model for the rest of the system. And once you prove you can do it on the Western trains, there's no reason you couldn't do that throughout the system. And I think that's a really important point we shouldn't overlook, that if I can cook a burger or a steak or a piece of salmon on the Empire Builder, I can absolutely do the same thing on the Silver Star. So really, I think, I don't know this for sure, but I would imagine that, as the COVID sort of grip eases, and people begin to return to traveling, and the workforce can begin to return to a normal way of working on board the trains. We're very hopeful. I'm very hopeful that we can expand the traditional dining beyond the Western trains. Amtrak, despite the Twitterverse's comments to the contrary, every time I broach this idea with Amtrak, they are open to it. They don't reject it. They don't say, no, we're never going to do that. It's more a case of how do we do that? We have to figure out how to do that. One of the things too that we've pushed very hard for in Congress, and Congress is very much on our side about this, is making sure that coach passengers can buy food in the dining car. You know, back in the day, you used to be able to do that. And of course, now you can't. Again, it's baby steps, but when I have talked to Amtrak about this issue in recent months, there has been much less resistance to the idea of having coach passengers buy into the diner. And that's great. But at the same time, the statistics suggest that a lot of people who ride coach don't want to use the diner, but they do deserve good food. So you can't just reopen the diner. You have to improve the food in the cafe car as well. It's not an either or. You got to do both. And so we're pushing them not only to allow coach passengers to have access to the dining car, but we're also pushing them to improve the offerings in the cafe car for those who can't go to the diner or can't afford it. It doesn't matter where you sit on that train. You deserve decent food, particularly if you're going to be in transit for 25 hours or 30 hours, which you are on some of these trains. And I think our elected officials are very committed to this idea. We were very our case on this issue was very much energized by the congressional interest, and when we lock arms with advocates, and as Maddie noted, the survey results, the petitions, all of those things together. I say this all the time, gang. Advocacy works. You really have to be patient, but advocacy works, and we are starting to see this turn around a little bit. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see some really good news start to come out here in the next few weeks and months about dining service generally, because Congress has made it extremely clear in hearings and in legislative language that they want this service to return. And clearly, we as passengers want it to return as well. So there's a lot of incentive for Amtrak to do a good job with this. And I think they really want to do a good job with it. Doesn't mean it'll be perfect from day one, but I suspect we're going to see a lot of good things come out here in the next few months.
All right. Next question. When will all passengers, actually this kind of follows up what you were just saying, Jim. When will all passengers have access to full meals? Why can't coach passengers opt in to a full dining now?
I should have stopped talking. So listen, the Western trains are being turned on here in June, just in a couple of weeks for full meals, and everything we're being told suggests that they're going to not just bring back the food that they had, but it will be better food and it will be better presented. We've all seen the reports out there on China, on real dishes, getting rid of all that wasteful packaging. So that's a great start. But given the scale of what you have to do, it's 305 trains a day. It's probably a good thing to work out all those kinks on the Western trains first. I don't know how long that takes. But as I said earlier, my suspicion is that once you figure out how to execute a really good product on those Western trains, you can clone that approach elsewhere in the system. I know Amtrak's interested in doing that. They've said as much, and they've been saying it for a year, but it just took them a little while to figure out how to do it. And obviously COVID played into this, right? You were trying to minimize the number of crew that were on the front lines, exposed to folks. We've written about this before, and so I won't repeat it, but it is coming. It's just not coming yet. But I know for a fact that the Congress is pushing, that we are pushing, and that Amtrak is receptive. And I would not be surprised if we could see coach passengers buying dining car meals within the next, I'm going to guess 6, 7, 8 months, something like that. Because by then we should be able to see this all around the system. And that would be terrific.
So actually, we have time for. I'm going to grab a question from the chat. And I know, Madison, this is actually something you've brought up a couple times, especially even back in the days of the original internships over by rail.
Mhm.
Question from Dan Callahan: does the expansion of wireless communications ever come up, like 5G, Wi-Fi, things for like point of sale? How does
Yeah.
that come up in this greater conversation?
That is a great question. Thank you, Dan. Love that intention there. So this is kind of interesting because with 5G connectivity, there was an attempt a while back by a number of conductors to put hotspots on the train. The ones you would get at your cell phone store. But what we really need is communications companies and partnerships with Amtrak. This would take a dedicated amount of funding. I imagine some congressional support as well. The real hangup is tunnels and also traversing remote areas that don't currently have 3, 4, or 5G service. There's patches throughout Wyoming, throughout Nebraska, Kansas, in the deep South as well, where there just isn't great service. So even if you were to put those pods on board, you wouldn't necessarily be able to. And then when you look at things like satellite service, you're not going to be able to stream video. And so I would love to hear more feedback, especially from our association members who work within the field of communications and technical installation, on how they see working beyond things like losing coverage when you go through a tunnel or through areas where none of the cell phone providers do provide service currently. I think there are solutions to it, and I would love to have experts in the field weigh in there.
Awesome. Okay, so we do have. I'm going to squeeze in one last one. There was a great one that actually just popped up at the end here. Probably towards Jim. Could you please address sleeping car staffing? James Tilley said there was no attendant assigned to his car the last 3 trips.
Woof.
It's rough. This was something that we warned in our testimony before Congress last fall. We warned that this could happen, that the furloughs were not the kind of thing that you could easily reverse. And it was why we pushed so hard last fall to not go to a 3X schedule, so that we could keep the staff in place and could keep running those trains. Because once you furlough people, they need to go off and do other things. And that's what's happening. I think that it's pretty clear that you haven't been able to get everybody back onto the train to work the train. And even the folks that you can get back have to requalify in their crafts. We brought this up. In fact, then FRA Administrator Ron Vittori also brought that up. So we knew this was coming. And now that it's here, it's taking a longer time to bring people back onto the train to work on those trains. It's unfortunate. It was avoidable, but it's where we are. And I know that everyone's trying their best to get the staff back on the trains and get people rehired, requalified in time for the summer rush.
All right, thank you, Jim. I'm going to close it out. Jim, Sean, Madison, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone. There was over 250 of you that attended today. You sold out. We were up to a wait list for reservations for this. Join us next month. We will be back in our regional format. We will be traveling to the Pacific Northwest. Stay tuned for some more details. We'll be doing that end of June. Please follow us on @RailPassengers on Twitter, NARP Rail on Facebook and YouTube. Quick little housekeeping. I've been getting a lot of emails from our members and supporters about where the newsletter has been so far in 2021 as the sort of de facto editor on staff. Please stay tuned to your email boxes tomorrow, sometime in the afternoon. It's coming back. So I know a lot of you will be very happy. We have a little celebration to do. It is, I think, the 56th year actually of the newsletter, so we couldn't let you guys down. So again, on behalf of the staff, thank you all for coming. Thank you, our presenters, and have a great day and a very safe holiday weekend.